Welcome back to Ella's Diaries. If you're new here, don't forget to like, comment, share, and subscribe. Now, get comfortable because this story is about to begin. Let's get into it.
The ballroom glittered like it had been built to make ordinary people feel small. Chandeliers dripped gold light over 300 of the city's most powerful guests. Champagne flutes clinked. Silk whispered against marble. Brenda stood in the middle of it, doing what she'd learned to do in every room like this one. Spine straight, drink steady, face calm. It had taken her 3 years of underbidding for smaller contracts, showing up early, staying late, and proving her design philosophy could actually make money before anyone in this world would even take her meeting. Tonight was supposed to be the reward for all of it, her name finally circulating in the same rooms as the developers who used to walk past her without a second glance. Then she heard it. "She's too big to be arm candy." The voice came from a cluster of women near the bar, not even bothering to lower their tone. One of them laughed, sharp, delighted, cruel. Someone should tell her men like that don't bring women like her. They display them. If they bring them at all, another voice added, softer, meaner, for how casually it landed. I give it a week before he trades her in for something the cameras actually want to photograph. Brenda didn't turn around. She'd heard worse. She'd survived worse. But tonight was supposed to be different. Tonight, she'd finally earned her seat at this table, after months of pitching, fighting, proving herself to men who looked straight through her. Her hand tightened around the stem of her glass. She would not give them the satisfaction of watching her run. Before we get further into this one, if you've ever had to hold your head up in a room that wasn't built for you, drop a comment below. Ella wants to know you're out there. Okay, back to the story. Across the ballroom, a man in a black suit went completely still. He hadn't meant to hear it, but in a room this loud, cruelty always finds a way to carry. His name was Yun-Woo Kang, and most people in this room only knew half of who he was. To the world, he was the chairman of an investment empire that touched half the buildings on the skyline. To the 12 men who answered to no one but him, he was something far more dangerous. But right now, none of that mattered. What mattered was the woman across the room, who'd just been humiliated in front of 300 strangers, and hadn't flinched. He recognized her. Months ago, she'd sat across from his executives in a glass conference room and told them, calmly, that their entire redevelopment plan was going to fail, because it was designed for people who already had everything, and it ignored everyone else. She'd been right. Nobody in that room had liked hearing it. He'd respected the hell out of her for saying it anyway. Now she was standing 20 feet away, absorbing cruelty with the same steady spine she'd used to challenge a boardroom full of men twice her size in power. He found himself watching her the way he watched a problem he hadn't solved yet. Behind Brenda, the socialites weren't finished. One of them stepped sideways, just enough to close the gap at the reserved table, just enough to make it obvious there wasn't a seat left for her. "Oh, were you trying to sit here?" the woman said, all fake sweetness. "I just assumed you'd be more comfortable standing." Laughter rippled through the group. Brenda felt her face heat. Felt 300 people not looking at her, and somehow feeling every one of them anyway. She set her glass down. Enough. She would leave with her dignity intact, even if she had to walk out of this room alone. She turned toward the door, and stopped, because the room had gone quiet. Yun-Woo Kang was standing now, one hand resting on the back of an empty chair at his table. His eyes weren't on the socialites who'd humiliated her. They were on Brenda. "Brenda," he said, his voice carrying easily across the sudden silence. "Come, sit down." She didn't move. Neither did anyone else in the room. "I'd like to introduce all of you," he continued, calm, unhurried, "to the woman I intend to marry." The gasp that followed sounded like it belonged to a room watching a car crash in slow motion. because everyone in that ballroom knew exactly who Yunwoo Kang was. And nobody, not one person in that room, had ever heard him claim a woman in public before. One sentence. That's all it took to flip the entire room upside down. But the second Brenda felt 300 pairs of eyes swing toward her, she understood this wasn't just a rescue. It was a statement, and she had no idea yet what it was going to cost her. As she walked, she passed within a few feet of the women who'd laughed at her 20 minutes earlier. Not one of them was laughing now. One had gone pale. Another suddenly found her champagne glass fascinating enough to stare into for the rest of the evening. Brenda didn't gloat. She didn't need to. Their silence said everything her own voice hadn't gotten the chance to yet. She crossed the room because staying frozen was worse than moving, and sat because the alternative was making an even bigger scene. The moment she was close enough, she kept her voice to a whisper only he could hear. "What are you doing?" "Fixing something," Yunwoo said, just as quietly. "You looked like you were about to walk out of a room you earned your way into. I wasn't going to let them win that." "I didn't ask you to fix anything." "I know." A faint, almost invisible edge of amusement. "You didn't have to." Underneath the calm, Brenda caught something else. Something he probably hadn't meant to show her. He was angry. Genuinely angry. Not performing outrage for an audience. Actually offended on her behalf. "You remember me," she said. It wasn't a question. "The redevelopment pitch. You told my head of acquisitions his numbers were built on a lie." His mouth curved, barely. "You were right. He hated you for it." "And you?" "I hired someone who tells the truth, even when it costs her something. That's rare." His voice dropped lower. "I don't forget rare." A moment later, he leaned in, close enough that the gesture read as intimate to everyone watching, but the words were pure strategy. "There's something you should know," he said. "My family's been pressuring me to announce a fiancé tonight. They've already chosen who they want it to be. It isn't you." Brenda's stomach dropped. "Then why say what you just said?" "Because for the next few weeks, I'd rather disappoint them than watch you walk out of a room defeated." He held her gaze. "I'm not asking you to fall in love with me. I'm asking you to let the world believe something that isn't true, until it stops being useful to either of us." She stared at him, trying to find the trick in it. There had to be a trick. "So what? I just play along? Smile for photographs? Pretend? You stay in rooms like this one on your own terms. That's all I'm offering. What you do with it is entirely up to you." Somewhere behind them, a cluster of older men in dark suits had gone very still, watching the two of them with expressions Brenda couldn't read yet, but would learn to fear soon enough. She didn't know it yet, but the hardest choice of the night wasn't whether to say yes. It was what would happen once she did. Brenda pulled her hand back from the table, gently, but deliberately, putting a few inches of space between them. "If I do this," she said, "it's not because you rescued me. I don't need rescuing. I'm doing this because I decide when I leave a room, not them." She nodded, barely, toward the women who'd laughed at her. "Tonight, I decide I'm staying." Something shifted in Yunwoo's expression. Not surprise exactly. More like he'd expected a grateful answer, and gotten something sharper instead. He liked it more. "Understood," he said. Then, in front of the entire room, he reached over and rested his hand gently over hers on the table. It was supposed to look like affection, supposed to sell the story. But the second his palm covered her knuckles, Brenda felt something that didn't feel like performance at all. They stayed like that a beat too long for it to have been nothing. An older man in a navy suit approached, curious, already fishing for information about the chairman's companion. Brenda didn't wait for Yunwoo to answer for her. She talked about the redevelopment project herself, the design philosophy, the parts of the plan that made spaces feel like they belonged to everyone, instead of just the people who could afford to be comfortable in them. She wasn't performing. She was simply, finally, being heard. By the time she finished, 3 more guests had drifted into the conversation, asking real questions. Nobody in that circle was laughing at her anymore. Yunwoo watched from a step back, saying almost nothing. He didn't need to rescue her a second time. She was doing that herself. Later, when the crowd thinned and the noise dulled into background hum, Brenda slipped out onto a private balcony overlooking the city. She needed 30 seconds where nobody was watching her. She didn't hear him follow her out. "You don't have to perform out here," Yunwoo said quietly. "There's no one to convince." Brenda's composure cracked. Just slightly. Just for him. It still hurt. What they said. I know I'm not supposed to let it, but it did. Being hurt doesn't make you weak. He said it simply, like it was obvious. It makes you honest. She looked at him, surprised. Most people either told her to ignore the cruelty or told her she was overreacting to it. He'd done neither. The night air was cooler out here, and she hadn't realized she was cold until he shifted his jacket off his shoulders and settled it gently over hers. An automatic gesture, like he'd done it 100 times, though this was the first. "How long?" Brenda asked slowly. "Have you actually been paying attention to me? Before tonight, I mean." Yunwoo didn't look away. "Longer than I probably should admit." Neither of them said anything else for a moment. The quiet stretched, comfortable in a way Brenda hadn't expected it to be. "For what it's worth," Yunwoo said finally, "you make a terrible actress." Brenda blinked. "Excuse me?" "Everyone in there already believes this is real." A faint smile. "You're not even trying to sell it." "Maybe I'm just that good." "Or maybe," he said, "it's not entirely an act." She didn't have an answer for that. And the fact that she didn't have an answer told her everything she didn't want to know yet. The next morning, before her coffee had even cooled, Brenda found a black car waiting outside her building. Yunwoo didn't get out. He didn't need to. His driver simply held the door until she climbed in, half annoyed, half curious. "You said one night," she said, before he'd even finished sitting back. "I did. So why do I feel like you're about to tell me it wasn't?" Yunwoo didn't waste time. The elders don't forget a public promise. "If I quietly walk this back in a week, it won't look like the engagement ended. It'll look like I decided you weren't good enough to keep." Brenda's jaw tightened. That sentence hit closer than he probably realized. "So what? I stay engaged to a stranger indefinitely?" "I need this to hold for a few months, long enough to buy real time with the board." He paused. "And I want you to stay on as lead for the redevelopment project." "That part was never about the engagement, Brenda. I wanted you running it before I ever said your name in that ballroom." That part, at least, she believed. "If I do this," she said slowly, "it's on my terms. My project stays mine. No one waters down my design because it makes rich people uncomfortable." Agreed. "And I keep my own apartment, my own life. This doesn't touch anything that isn't the two of us pretending in public." Agreed. She studied him for a long moment, looking for the catch. She didn't find one, which somehow worried her more than if she had. "One more thing," she added. "If we're doing this, you don't get to disappear into chairman mode every time it's convenient. If I'm playing your fiancé in public, I get the real version of you in private, not the performance." That seemed to catch him off guard more than anything else she'd said. "Nobody's asked me for that before." "Then it's about time somebody did." "Okay," she said finally. "I'm in." She had no idea that single word was about to pull her directly into a war that had been building for years, one that had nothing to do with her, until suddenly, it had everything to do with her. Brenda had agreed to play fiancé long enough to protect her project and her pride. She hadn't agreed to actually start caring what Yunwoo Kang thought of her work. But somewhere in the weeks that followed, that's exactly what happened. By the following morning, photos from the gala were already circulating. Brenda's hand resting in Yunwoo's, captured mid-declaration, captioned everywhere, from society blogs to gossip accounts with some version of the same shocked headline. Investment chairman names unknown American consultant as fiancée. Comment sections were exactly as cruel and exactly as fascinated as she expected. For every person asking who she was, there was another insisting she didn't belong in the photo at all. She made herself stop reading after the 10th comment. What she didn't expect was her own inbox, filled almost overnight with messages from developers who'd rejected her design proposals a year earlier, suddenly eager to revisit the conversation. It should have felt like vindication. Instead, it felt like proof that most of the world had only ever been listening to the man standing beside her, not to her. She saved every message. She didn't respond to a single one. Their first real clash came fast. Yunwoo's executives wanted to trim Brenda's design, cut the public gathering spaces, raise the retail price points, turn the development into another glass monument only the wealthy could enjoy. Brenda refused outright, in the middle of a boardroom, in front of everyone. "You're describing a building that photographs well and means nothing," she said. "I didn't take this project to build another wall with better lighting." Yunwoo watched her hold her ground against 6 men who outranked her on paper, and none of whom she seemed even slightly afraid of. Later, alone in his office, he pushed back himself, testing her, maybe, or just curious how far her conviction actually went. "You could compromise," he said. "Just slightly. It would make my life easier." "I know." Brenda didn't blink. "I'm not going to." He almost smiled. "I wasn't really asking you to." That respect turned into something almost dangerously comfortable over the next 2 weeks. They started working late together, not because either of them needed to, but because neither of them found a reason to stop. One night, surrounded by rolled-up blueprints and cold takeout, Brenda caught him watching her sketch, instead of reviewing the numbers in front of him. "You're supposed to be checking my math," she said, without looking up. "Your math is fine." He didn't look away. "I got distracted." "By what?" "You get a line right here." He tapped lightly, just above his own brow. "When you're solving something. Right before you know you've solved it." Brenda's pen stopped moving. "That's oddly specific for someone who claims he isn't paying attention to me." "I never claimed that." His voice dropped, quieter than the room needed. "I said I was watching. I never said I'd stopped." For a second, neither of them moved. The takeout went cold. The blueprints stayed exactly where they were. Then Brenda's phone buzzed, breaking whatever had been building, and the moment folded itself back into 2 people, pretending they hadn't just come close to something neither of them was ready to name. It was the first time Brenda realized they didn't just tolerate each other's stubbornness. They respected it, and underneath the respect, something else was quietly taking root. The threat came 4 days later. Brenda arrived at her office to find her design files accessed overnight. Nothing stolen, nothing destroyed, just a message left behind that made it clear someone wanted her to know they could get to her work anytime they wanted. She called Yunwoo before she'd even finished processing how scared she actually was. By that evening, 2 security guards were posted outside her apartment. By the next morning, a driver was assigned to follow her everywhere she went. Brenda was furious. "I didn't ask for a security detail," she snapped, the second Yunwoo walked through her door. "I asked you to tell me who did this. I'm handling it." "By turning my life into a hostage situation?" She crossed her arms. "Protecting me doesn't mean deciding what I'm allowed to do anymore. That's not protection. That's control with better manners." Do you know how many times in my life someone's decided what I can handle without asking me first? Her voice cracked, just slightly, before she caught it. I need you to be different than that. Not because you're trying to protect me, because you actually see me as someone who gets to decide. Yunwoo went quiet, the kind of quiet that meant he was actually listening, not just waiting to argue. You're right, he said finally. I'll pull the driver back. Just let me keep the guards on the building. That's not negotiable. Brenda exhaled, some of the anger draining out of her. Fine. Who was it? Yunwoo's expression shifted into something darker. That's the problem, he said. It wasn't outside interference. The access came from inside my own organization. Brenda felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her. Someone close to you did this? Someone close to me, Yunwoo said quietly, is trying to send me a message, and I don't yet know who, or how far they're willing to go to make sure I hear it. Brenda had already survived a public humiliation and an anonymous threat. What she hadn't survived yet was the moment the man she was starting to trust turned out to be hiding something bigger than either of them. It started with a spreadsheet. She'd been pulling investor disclosures for a routine compliance check, the kind of tedious paperwork nobody actually reads twice. But one column of ownership percentages didn't sit right with her, and Brenda had never once in her career been the type of person who could leave a number alone once it stopped making sense. 2 nights of digging later, buried in the financial backing for the redevelopment project, she found a pattern she wasn't supposed to notice. 3 independent investment firms, all quietly tied back to the same handful of syndicate elders she'd seen watching her that first night at the gala. The money wasn't just old wealth sitting in the background. It was active, moving, manipulated in ways that only made sense if someone wanted her inclusive redesign to fail. Because her version of the project didn't leave enough room for the kind of profit that funded things nobody wanted looked at too closely. She confronted Yunwoo with the printouts still in her hand. Tell me this is a coincidence. He didn't. He couldn't. It's not, he said. The marriage pressure and this project were never 2 separate problems, Brenda. They were the same one. Her stomach turned to ice. Explain that, now. The elders wanted me married to a specific woman. Her family's connections were supposed to protect exactly this kind of arrangement. Your redesign threatens their money. Your success threatens their control. He met her eyes, unflinching. When I chose you at that gala, it wasn't only about the insult. Some part of me already knew choosing you would make their plans harder to protect. Brenda felt something crack open in her chest. So I was a strategy. At first, he didn't look away from her, even though it clearly cost him something. And then I stopped seeing you as a solution to anything. I started seeing you as Brenda, but I understand if that timeline doesn't make any of this easier to hear. It didn't. Because now Brenda couldn't tell which parts of the last few weeks had been real and which had been calculated from the very beginning. The balcony, his hand over hers, the jacket around her shoulders in the cold. I need you to leave, she said quietly. Brenda. I need you to leave, she said again, steadier this time. He left. He didn't argue on the way out, didn't call after her. He simply walked to his car, sat behind the wheel, and stayed there for nearly 20 minutes without starting the engine, replaying the exact moment, months ago, when protecting her had quietly become something he wanted for its own sake, and wondering if she'd ever believe that timeline again. And Brenda sat alone in her apartment, staring at evidence of a financial conspiracy she hadn't asked to be part of, wondering if she'd just been the smartest woman in every room, or the easiest one to use. The nights were the hardest part. In the daylight, she could throw herself into work and almost forget the way his hand had felt over hers. At night, alone, she kept replaying the balcony, the jacket around her shoulders, the way he'd told her being hurt didn't make her weak. and wondering how much of it had been real, and how much had simply been good strategy wearing a kind face. She didn't have an answer. That was the part that scared her most. She didn't return his calls for 4 days. She didn't touch his money, his security, or his name. She went back to the one thing that had never once required his permission, her own work. Danielle showed up on the 3rd day, unannounced, with takeout and absolutely no patience for silence. "You've been ignoring my calls," Danielle said, dropping the bags on the counter like a challenge. "Which means either you're dead, or you're doing that thing where you disappear into yourself instead of talking about it." "I'm not doing that." "You're doing that." Danielle sat across from her, arms crossed, cousin instincts fully activated. Talk. So Brenda talked. All of it. The spreadsheet, the confession, the 4 days of silence. Danielle listened without interrupting, which was rare enough that Brenda knew she was actually worried. "Okay," Danielle said finally. "Real question. Not a mean one. Do you actually want him? Or are you just relieved somebody finally chose you first, for once, in front of everybody?" Brenda opened her mouth to answer fast, then stopped. Because she genuinely didn't know. "That's what I thought," Danielle said gently. "So don't figure out the rest of it until you figure that part out first." It wasn't comfort, exactly. It was better than comfort. It was honesty, from someone who loved her enough not to let her hide inside a nice-sounding lie. Instead of chasing an easy answer, Brenda did something quieter, and far more dangerous to the people trying to control her. She stopped asking herself whether Yoonwoo still wanted her. She started asking herself what she actually wanted, and whether she was willing to let one man's family war cost her the one thing she'd built entirely on her own. Yoonwoo, for his part, did something that cost him just as much. He didn't send anyone after her. He didn't flood her office with flowers or grand gestures designed to look good from a distance. He quietly removed himself from every decision touching her consultancy, leaving her project exactly as she'd built it, untouched, unclaimed, entirely hers. It was the first time in his life he'd loved someone by doing less, not more. More than once, he started a message to her and deleted it before it sent. Not because he didn't mean it, because he'd finally understood that meaning it wasn't the same as being entitled to say it whenever he wanted. Yoon Se-ra found him alone in his office one night, staring at nothing in particular. "You could just call her," she said. "I could." He didn't look up. "I'm not going to." Sarah studied him for a long moment, the boy she remembered, still visible somewhere underneath the man he'd become. "You've spent your whole life taking what you wanted, the moment you wanted it. This is the first time I've ever watched you wait for someone else's answer, instead of deciding it for them. Is that supposed to be a compliment? It's supposed to be the truth." She let herself almost smile. "I think it's the first time I've been genuinely proud of you." 4 days after Brenda stopped answering his calls, she was buried in her own project files at 1 a.m., looking for anything that could save the redevelopment without needing his money or his name attached to it at all. That's when she found it. She'd nearly given up for the night, eyes burning, coffee gone cold beside her keyboard, when she noticed it, a note in the margin of her own earliest draft, written months before any of this started, before she'd ever met Yoon-woo Kang, a backup funding structure she'd sketched out and abandoned as unnecessary at the time. It wasn't unnecessary anymore. It was exactly what she needed. Her original design already contained the answer, a restructured funding model that routed investment through smaller, independent partners instead of the syndicate-linked firms hiding behind the project. It would take the elders' leverage away completely. She didn't need Yoonwoo to rescue her plan. She could save it herself. But sitting there at 1 a.m., staring at the solution glowing on her screen, Brenda understood exactly what putting this plan into motion would actually mean. It wouldn't just save her project. It would force Yoonwoo to choose, publicly and permanently, between the family that raised him and the future she was about to hand him, whether he was ready for it or not. Brenda had already found her way out of the mess Yoonwoo's family built. What she hadn't planned for was discovering that saving her own project might cost him everything he had left. 2 days after she finished her funding model, a courier delivered a letter to her office. Formal, cold, unsigned by name, only by the Kang Family Board. It accused her of violating confidentiality, of overstepping her role, of putting a project she didn't fully understand at risk. It was polished, professional, and underneath every polite sentence, it said the same thing the socialites at the gala had said with less paperwork. You don't belong here. Step aside. For one long, ugly second, the old fear crept back in, the one that had followed her through every boardroom, every gala, every room that had ever made her feel like her presence needed an explanation. Maybe they're right. Maybe you really did go too far this time. She let herself feel it. Then she folded the letter in half and set it down. She wasn't going to shrink. Not this time. Not ever again, if she could help it. She called Marcus. They're trying to push me out, she told her old mentor, pacing her apartment at midnight. Nicely, in writing, but that's what it is. Then don't give them a reason to, Marcus said simply. Build something so clean they can't touch it. She already had the outline. Now she spent 3 straight days turning it into something undeniable. Pulling permit records, tracing ownership structures back through shell entities, cross-checking every number against public filings, until the pattern wasn't just something she suspected. It was something she could prove. She wasn't waiting for Yoonwoo to save the project. She was building the case that would save it herself. Across the city, Yoonwoo was fighting a very different battle, one with no paperwork at all. The elders called him into a private meeting that felt less like a conversation and more like a verdict already decided. Back her project publicly, one of them said, and you're choosing an outsider over your own family's future. Distance yourself, said another, and the project stays under our structure, quietly, the way it always should have. You've had your fun, a third added, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. No one begrudges you that, but this ends before it costs us something we can't get back. Yoonwoo sat in a room he'd sat in 100 times before, hearing an argument he'd heard his entire life. Loyalty meant obedience. Family meant control. Love, if it ever came up at all, meant something you managed, not something you handed to someone else freely. He thought about his father, who'd taught him that softness got people killed. He remembered being 12 years old, watching his father end a phone call, and immediately rearrange his face into something unreadable. A lesson delivered without a single word. Whatever you feel it alone, and you never let anyone see the cost. Yoonwoo had spent 26 years being an excellent student of that lesson. He thought about Brenda, refusing to disappear in a ballroom full of people who wanted her to. And for the first time in his life, Yoonwoo understood that the version of strength he'd been raised on wasn't strength at all. It was fear, wearing a very expensive suit. I'm not distancing myself, he said quietly, and I'm not asking permission anymore. The room went cold, in a way that had nothing to do with the air conditioning. Madame Han found Brenda 2 nights later, in a quiet corner of a restaurant Brenda hadn't told anyone she'd be visiting. She was already seated when Brenda arrived, a pot of tea going cold between them, like she'd been waiting there far longer than 2 minutes. You shouldn't be here, Brenda said carefully. She'd learned by now that nothing in this family happened by accident. Neither should this exist. Madame Han slid a folder across the table. Thin, unmarked, deliberately unremarkable. I've spent 2 years collecting what's in there. I was waiting for someone brave enough, or foolish enough, to actually use it. Brenda opened it slowly. Bank transfers, falsified permits, a financial trail connecting the elders directly to the very manipulation Brenda had already started to uncover on her own. It didn't just support her case. It completed it. "Why give this to me?" Brenda asked. "Why not Yunwoo?" Because he'd hesitate to use it. It would cost him people he's known his whole life. Madame Han's expression didn't soften. Exactly, but something behind it did. "You won't hesitate. You've spent your whole life being told you don't belong in rooms like this one. I'm simply making sure you walk into the next one with everything you need to stay." Brenda closed the folder, her pulse loud in her own ears. She finally had everything required to expose the truth. Completely, publicly, permanently. But using it wouldn't just end the elders' scheme. It would tear apart the only family Yunwoo had ever known. The board meeting was scheduled for the following Monday. Brenda spent the weekend rehearsing exactly 3 sentences, not because she needed the rest of it memorized, but because she knew from experience that the first 30 seconds in a room like that one decided whether anyone actually listened to the rest. She didn't wait for an invitation. She requested the floor herself. She stood at the front of a room full of men who'd spent weeks trying to write her out of their own project, and she didn't raise her voice once. She laid it out clean: the shell companies, the falsified permits, the financial trail connecting 3 independent firms straight back to the same handful of elders, now questioning her right to be in the room at all. One of the elders tried to cut her off halfway through, dismissing her as someone who doesn't understand how these arrangements work. Brenda didn't raise her voice. She simply set the next document on the table, the one bearing his own signature on a transfer he'd sworn, on record, he'd never authorized. The room went very quiet after that. Then she did the part that mattered most. She didn't just expose the problem, she solved it. "Here's the funding structure that replaces theirs," she said, sliding printed copies across the table. "Independent partners. Transparent ownership, no shell companies, no hidden leverage, no one person's family able to hold the whole project hostage again." She tapped the second page. "It costs the project 8% more up front. It saves it from ever being quietly gutted by people who were never supposed to control it in the first place. The building still gets built. It just doesn't get built on a lie." Silence settled over the room, the same kind of silence that had swallowed a ballroom months earlier, when a different kind of announcement had changed everything. This time, Brenda wasn't the woman standing off to the side, waiting to be chosen. She was the one who'd just rewritten the terms of the entire room. Yunwoo stood next. Every elder in that room expected him to defend his family's name, soften the blow, find some careful, diplomatic middle ground the way he always had. He didn't. "Brenda's plan stands," he said, "not because I'm asking you to trust her, because she's already proven she doesn't need your trust to be right." One of the elders started to object. Yunwoo cut him off. Calm, absolute, final. "I'm restructuring the legitimate business, effective immediately. Every holding connected to what she just exposed will be dissolved or handed to outside oversight. If that costs me influence in this room, it costs me influence in this room." "You're choosing her over your own family," someone said, like an accusation. "No," Yunwoo said. "I'm choosing not to build my future on the same thing that taught me love means owning someone. That's not her fault. That's not even about her." His eyes found Brenda's across the room, steady. "That's about who I want to be." It cost him exactly what they warned him it would. The elders lost their leverage. The same week the falsified permits became public record. 2 of them stepped down quietly, rather than face what would come next. The syndicate's grip on the legitimate business loosened for the first time in a generation, not because Yunwoo destroyed anyone, but because he simply stopped protecting a system built on people like Brenda staying small. He didn't inherit an empire that year. He inherited something smaller, cleaner, and entirely his own. It wasn't painless. 2 uncles stopped taking his calls. An aunt who'd helped raise him sent back his gifts, unopened, for the better part of a year. There were nights he sat alone in an apartment far too large for one person, wondering if he'd traded a family for a principal. But every time the doubt crept in, he thought about the version of himself that would have caved, the one who would have let Brenda's project quietly disappear to keep the peace. And he knew, without needing to weigh it twice, which man he'd rather be. Months later, Brenda stood in the lobby of the finished redevelopment, her redevelopment, now carrying her name on the consultancy she'd finally launched under her own terms. Warm light instead of cold marble. Seating built for actual bodies, not just photographs. A front desk at a height that didn't force anyone to look up to be acknowledged. Small things. The kind of things nobody thanks you for noticing, because the people who need them shouldn't have to explain why they matter. The space did exactly what she'd promised it would. People walked in off the street who'd never have been welcomed through those doors under the old design, and they didn't hesitate at the threshold. They didn't check the room for permission. They just walked in like they belonged. Because they did. Danielle found her first, pulling her into a hug tight enough to lift her half off her heels. "Look at you," she said, eyes suspiciously bright. "Look at this. You did this." "We did this," Brenda said. "You didn't let me hide for 4 days, remember?" "I'm putting that on my resume." Danielle grinned, then nodded toward the far wall. "Marcus is over there, pretending not to cry about the ceiling." Marcus found her a moment later, quieter, the way he'd always been. "Your first big opportunity," he said, looking around at the space, "and it took you long enough to stop shrinking it down to fit somebody else's comfort. I had a good teacher." "You had good instincts," Marcus corrected. "I just told you to trust them." She was still taking it in when she noticed him at the far end of the lobby. No entourage, no driver waiting outside, no press release trailing behind him. Just Yun-woo, hands in his pockets, looking, for once, like a man with absolutely nothing to offer but himself. "No deal this time?" Brenda asked, walking toward him. "No deal?" His mouth curved, faint and real. "No arrangement. No family expecting an announcement. I'm not here to ask you to be my fiancée, chosen woman, or anything else with a title attached to it." "Then why are you here?" "Because I want you. Just you. And this time, the choice is entirely yours. Not because I need it to be, but because I finally understand that's the only kind of choosing that ever actually meant anything." Brenda studied him for a long moment, the way she'd studied him that very first night, looking for the trick. She still didn't find one. "You still owe me an answer, you know," she said. "That night on the balcony, I asked how long you'd been paying attention. You never actually gave me a number. 8 months, 11 days. No hesitation this time. I counted." Something in her chest loosened, warm and unguarded. "I spent a long time," she said quietly, "thinking being chosen was the same thing as being loved. It took me nearly losing both to figure out the difference. And now? Now I choose myself first." She let that sit, let it matter. "And because I choose myself first, I get to choose you too. Not because you're powerful, not because you protected me. Because of who you became when you finally learned to stand beside me instead of in front of me." Yun-woo reached for her hand, not a performance this time, not a statement for a watching room. Just his hand in hers, quiet and certain, the way it should have been from the very beginning. They walked the length of the lobby together, slowly, and he let her lead, pausing when she pointed out a detail, listening when she explained why a certain sightline mattered, why a certain material had taken 4 rounds of arguing with contractors to get right. He didn't add commentary. He didn't try to improve on any of it. He just walked beside her, exactly where he'd learned he belonged. Later that evening, when a guest at the opening asked Yunwoo who the woman beside him was, he didn't call her his fiancée. He didn't call her his chosen one, or his companion, or anything that came with a title borrowed from someone else's approval. He simply said, "She's Brenda." And for the first time in either of their lives, that was more than enough. Not his fiancée, not his chosen one, not a title borrowed from someone else's approval. Just a name, hers, whole, unedited, standing exactly where she'd always belonged.
If this one had you feeling some type of way, you know what to do. Tell Ella in the comments which part got you the most, and we'll see you in the next one.